One place for all the ways we play. This is Stadia.
Cloud gaming is bad, streaming for games is impractical for all but a relatively small number of upscale consumers in markets with reliable broadband service. It's terrible for games preservation, which is already a goddamn joke in this industry, and Stadia sounds like a prescription sleep medication. That's my thoughts for now. Anyway. A recent article by Simon Parkin of The New Yorker gave some attention to Tom Clancy's The Division 2, because I guess somebody had to, focusing on the absurdity of Ubisoft having to apologize for making a tasteless joke about the game, and then double absurdity of then clarifying that they believe the problem they needed to clarify was not that the joke was in bad taste, but that it implied there was anything remotely political to be read into their game about heavily armed paramilitary fighters battling for resources in the ruins of plague-blighted Washington, D.C.
With the country slipping into civil war.
But the fight to save our nation from total collapse is far from over.
Get down! Everybody get down!
Roving packs of hyenas, religious outcasts, and depraved fascists prey on the weak and murder the innocent. It's time we kick our enemies out of their castles.
This is our defining moment. Our chance to take back our country.
Of course, if you're involved in gaming in any depth, this is where your eyes glaze over because you immediately understand that this is just the way things are and that there's no politics in our military shooter, of course not, is just game companies speak for, of course there are politics in it, we're not stupid, there's machine guns and a burned out White House and American flags everywhere, but we have to say there's not because if we don't, all the worst people on the internet will cluster together like a big ball from the end of Critters 2 and try to smash our Metacritic rating, and we've let AAA gaming creatively stagnate to the point that the audience is narrow and fickle enough for that to actually be a make-or-break problem for us. Now, the counter-argument to that, of course, is that setting a game in and around stuff that has inescapable political connections like government buildings, national flags, guns, law enforcement, any kind of military, is different from a game that actually spells out a specific message, i.e. the Mario Brothers are plumbers, but those games aren't about plumbing, which is true, but if asked, would you say those games are pro or anti regarding plumbers, or Italian Americans for that matter? Or how do you think the Sonic the Hedgehog games feel about animal testing? See, message and narrative is kind of like a smell. Just because you didn't mean for it to be there or not notice that it's there doesn't mean it's not there. Of course, we don't want politics in games. It's never really what anyone who says that is actually saying, and not just because politics is more of a description of action or methodology than a setting or a premise. It's not like saying don't put any baseball in a game, for example. Any game with a system of rules that it's governed by could be said to have a politics to it, and any game narrative featuring any system of government has at least a nominal political dimension to its themes. I mean, all of these characters are technically politicians and or holders of political office. The entire plot of Bad Dudes even was which presupposes that the President of the United States is a good guy who should not be kidnapped by ninjas, which has never been at any point in time a politically neutral statement. And it's not like this is a new conversation for video games. It happens all the time, and it used to happen more frequently and more interestingly back before you could fact-check every little thing on the internet. Old-timers like myself, or fans of the classics who picked up the SNK 40th anniversary set, which you should absolutely do, amazing collection and some of the best curation I've ever seen in this medium, may recall a multi-directional overhead shooter called Guerrilla War, which was basically a sidequel to the Ikari Warrior series, but with the added challenge of a rescue but don't shoot the hostages mechanic and an aesthetic that was more period tropical than G.I. Joe Rambo inspired, setting up the players as revolutionaries overthrowing an island nation's dictatorship in a scenario that vaguely alluded to various real-life revolutionary images familiar from recent history in Latin America at the time. Well, funny story. Originally, there was no vaguely about it. The original Japanese version of the game was called Guevara, as in Ernesto Che Guevara, and it was intended in a very loose sense as a gamified depiction of the overthrow of the Batista Cuban government by communist guerrillas during the 1950s Cuban Revolution. Not only was the Player 1 avatar explicitly meant to depict Guevara himself, Player 2 took on the role of Fidel Castro. Yes, really. And it wasn't intended as any sort of incendiary, ironic, or edgy sort of fashion. If you've played it as Guerrilla War, Guevara is otherwise the same game. Scrappy freedom fighters, mowing down waves of bad guys, rescuing good guys, defeating the bad guy leader and liberating the island. Viva la revolution. Yeah, so this is not a long enough show to properly parse the immensely complicated politics of Che Guevara's life and the multiple different sides, causes, ideologies he was at one point or another associated with. Suffice to say, while there's certainly always been an audience for Che as hero narrative, there has also just as long been a not at all insubstantial swath of people across racial, political, cultural, etc. lines who consider him to be a murderer, butcher, terrorist, war criminal, what have you. For whatever it's worth, I tend to be kind of cynical about revolutionaries. For my estimation, the real heroes of anything like that tend to be the people whose names you don't remember, not the guys whose face winds up on posters in frat boys' dorm rooms, but that's a different show. Either way, the game was obviously unreleasable in the United States and several other places in the world without its title, graphics, and narrative being reworked into the generic guerrilla war. Given that Cuba and Castro were considered an enemy nation, and, whole communities of Cuban-American refugee immigrants would have likely taken huge offense to a video game about how awesome Guevara supposedly was, which came as a surprise to the Japanese developers because they didn't really know they'd been making a political game and hadn't set out to do so. The director, Koji Abada, had been developing it as a police-themed shooter, but the head of the company was a big fan of military vehicles and tactics. That's mainly why SNK kept making games about tanks and helicopters back then. And he'd apparently been reading a book about Guevara's military and warfighting tactics as a guerrilla and decided that would be a better setting, so the game became Guevara. But this being the pre-internet era and the political and cultural situation in Japan being mostly disconnected from any issues relating to Cuba or Latin American socialist uprisings, most of the developers had never heard of Che Guevara and couldn't find more than basic boilerplate school history blurbs about the events of the Cuban Revolution, so they kind of fudged it the same way they would a movie game they only had a synopsis and poster to work from at the time. But whether they meant it or not, anyone who did have any tacit connection to the issues would tell you straight off that a game where you play as Che Guevara and Fidel Castro as the heroes is just about one of the most politically charged things you could release, whatever you think of the concept itself. In other words, trying to keep video games free of politics is like trying to keep them free of narrative or conflict even. You can try, and maybe you'll find a version of something where you and your immediate circle of friends can all stand around and be able to sniff the air and say, nope, just air here. But sooner or later, I guarantee you someone is gonna smell something. And when they do, games industry, shouldn't it at least smell good? Just a thought.